Outstanding. So another thing we think about is that a distributed or decentralized grid should allow decision makers or automated protocols operating within that system to sense, analyze, and act on information in a real-time way. So for you, John, this evolution is obviously going to require advanced communication and orchestration capabilities. Often that's going to be interoperability on what's happening both behind the meter and in front of the meter to optimize those outcomes. So how do you see the emergence of a digital grid affecting everyone from grid operators down to facility managers that you might interact with?
Yeah, sure, and I certainly second what Andrew said about the whole centralization piece will still be the generation piece aspect, but there is this distributed aspect, particularly driven by the consumer, or the prosumer, who wants to become more engaged in their energy markets. So as you look at to your question, Paul, as you look at the utility as an example, they would say, look, we want that capacity at the grid edge where our oldest grids, speaking of the United States, our oldest grids are our most populated cities. We can't drop a gas peaker plant in that vicinity, but we could put storage in every building in that area. So every building can effectively become a virtual power plant. The consumer or the building owner or the chief sustainability officer will say, we want to participate in markets, but we don't want to change our behavior. With storage in our system, specifically the software layer, we enable our customers to control their energy spend and participate in those markets. That's what the consumers want. The utility wants the capacity in specifically constrained areas, which again is very difficult in Manhattan and New Orleans for that matter. And so storage becomes that viable option. And a lot of utilities are embracing this and actually have bids out now, not to put peaker plants in, but to put storage in and other energy efficiency examples. I'll give you a quick one. In New York, Con Ed did an assessment that they needed to put more capacity into Brooklyn, Queens area. So what they decided to do is it's $1.2 billion of hardware. They went with a $200 million investment, which a large portion of that is specific to storage. And so there's a good example of, I think, a forward-thinking utility that's going to be utilizing new technology to enable a digital grid to help them offset a lot of costs and thus lower the ratepayers' bills.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way to think about even bridging to something that a lot of the comments that Rick made earlier. When we think about technologies across the board, whether it's this sector or otherwise, doing more with less and the ability, as John suggested, to find these important use cases where we can utilize technology and take out something that may have been an expensive, unfully utilized capability, and then take that and make it much more efficient, lower cost, and use that technology to do what we might think of as, say, software-defined resources on the edge, then minimizing the need for stranded resources back at the centralized capability, and going back and forth between all of those to be most effective, recognizing that we're always going to need both to work hand in hand. So on that note of the utilities and the evolving way that we're all, as both consumers or investors or members of the various stakeholder groups interacting with utilities, there's absolutely been a recognition of this way that the market's evolving. And that was specifically noted in a recent utility professional survey that asked participants to rank the #1 reason they might deploy renewables or distributed energy resources. And the #1 reason that came back in that survey was actually from customer sentiment. And that customer sentiment was oftentimes driven by large commercial customers with sustainability goals. You just heard about how those goals are driving real action on the edge. So for Anup, can you share your thoughts on the democratization of electricity procurement and the impact that that will have on the providers of that generation or electrons going forward?
Thanks, Paul. It's interesting. One of my favorite quotes by Warren Buffett is that the two great forces in the universe are gravity and compound interest. And I think that we're oftentimes thinking about this from a return perspective. So as an investor, things have to make economic sense. We're slaves, as we talked about earlier, to our giant Excel files telling us what the net present value of things should be, which I think misses out on potential black swan events and misses out on significant breakthroughs. So when we look at kind of the future of things that we are interested to invest in and things that we think are interesting, the place that you have to start is the financing. You know, if Andrea Arbach at Cambridge Associates puts out a great research report every quarter, which is publicly available, and where she has analyzed 850 funds who have then invested into over 3,000 companies. And she measures what is the returns for this over time. They track about $30 billion of capital that are flowing through the system all around kind of the new energy future. And what she's found is that returns are above 1x, that returns are positive IRRs, and so people can make money in the space. And I think that the challenge is, how does the utility model make sense in an environment where investors are still making money? And you know, it's the concept of the distributed energy. It's a lot of the stuff around storage. For us, what we are thinking about is how cities evolve, how our relationship with energy storage, how our relationship with driving works. You know, I have an 18-year-old daughter, as we were talking about last night at dinner, who has negative interest in ever getting a driver's license. You know, and I think that it's kind of social phenomenon like that. You know, why is consumer interest interesting? It's beyond, I want to make myself green. It's that I don't need a car. You know, so the business models themselves are changing. So, you know, the other thing that's kind of scary to me is I look outside here and I realize that kind of 75% of the jobs in the future haven't been created yet. You know, 8 years ago, there was no such thing as an Uber driver. And so as an investor, that's daunting, but super interesting, because I think that the economic rationality of an Excel spreadsheet just is not the way that you're going to make money going forward.
Fair enough. And before we move on, Andrew, do you want to comment on just the aspects of how, as investors, how we think about investing in this sector, mission-driven capabilities, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we at Obvious Ventures, we invest in what we call world-positive businesses and entrepreneurs who we think are trying to tackle the world's systemic challenges, and energy is a big part of that. We don't, beyond that, we don't measure carbon reduction criteria or other bottom line accounting other than the single bottom line, because we want to invest in businesses that we think are going to prove their effectiveness in attacking these global challenges through being a highly profitable, highly scalable business. So we're not concessionary, we don't consider ourselves impact investing, because we want to make the concept of impact investing redundant. And there's actually a slide on the screen here from Planet Labs, or now called Planet. This is a satellite company that helps people make decisions about things going on Earth. And it's a very world positive business, and it's, I think, scaling to become a very, very large player in the space. Those are the types of businesses that we want to be involved with, and I think when we look at energy and we look at the decentralization and the move toward renewables, we're just looking at ever increasingly profitable businesses. And you ask utility execs today about wind and solar, that's all they want to do. They're not raising their hands saying, I'd love to build another coal plant. They're looking at wind and solar as the future and coal as the now alternative energy of the past. And those proof points, I think, show that this is not really about drawing a line between doing good and making money, but instead drawing the connection between doing good and making money.
Outstanding. And to the point earlier, we do see there is really an increasing amount of interaction between utilities trying to reach out to their customers, trying to initiate this dialogue, and whether or not that's happened in the past, the activities that we're seeing now through startup companies or otherwise, they're working hand in hand with those utilities to be a bridge between them and yes, oftentimes they're existing customers, but now truly trying to think about how to get the best services, best capabilities, best products in the hands of their customers, whether they be single-family home consumers or large industrial customers that are looking for much more complex service products and capabilities now relative to what they may have expected in the future. And that's all being driven as part of this new consumer choice and democratization of the grid that we're seeing happening day by day right now. So, Peter, that really goes to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is that part of this evolution will very likely entail, and we've seen this in other categories, going from, in this instance, selling pure electrons to consumers to thinking about how we sell more comprehensive, as I said, services, products, capabilities, and what that business model may look like in the future. If you look at some instances and precedents of how that's played out, really you've seen a step function in terms of value creation when you're standing at the emergence of what could be a massive shift in the go-to-market.
The exciting thing to me is that I believe that in the next 10 years, we as society are going to go through a paradigm shift in our very relationship with energy and how we think about consuming energy and making our lives better with it. And I think some historical context helps paint that picture for what's ahead of us. Ever since we have been using energy as a society, we've paid for it on a unit consumed basis. Whether we were purchasing wood or whether our lives were powered with coal or with oil, it was always based on that unit basis. Now, as the country was getting electrified in the 40s and 50s, General Electric wanted to help the consumers, help the American people understand how they could make their lives better with electricity. Actually, Ronald Reagan starred in a show in the 1950s called General Electric Theater. And this show was the third most popular TV show in America in 1956. It reached 25 million viewers. And they were showing off how to live better electrically, how to live in an all-electric home, how to make your life better with lighting and with climate control. And what we have kind of grown so accustomed to is the last 40 years, we haven't been thinking about how we can use energy to improve the quality of our lives. It has been more about how do we reduce the cost of energy as a component in our life, how do we drive more efficiency, how do we manage the environmental impacts of our energy consumption. And the exciting thing right now is that we already have some of the key technology building blocks in place that are going to change that. So we have distributed energy generation that, rather than being something that we pay for on a consumption basis, it's a piece of hardware that we purchase once, and it uses a free fuel to generate electricity that is clean and also free at the margin. That, combined with what we're doing in energy storage, is going to lead to a paradigm shift, not unlike what we experienced in the 90s with internet access, where if you remember in the 90s when we were subscribing to CompuServe and we were buying so many megabytes to download per month, and then companies started to offer just a pipe of a given speed and unlimited consumption. That led to a blossoming of usage and of creative ways that people improved their life with information connectivity. The same thing is going to happen both in the residential world at home as well as in industry, when with distributed generation and storage, stakeholders are able to make their own decisions for how much generation they want to have on site, and they will be able to buy capacity that they will then be able to make use of as they wish, without the mental equation of how much they're going to consume. And what that will do is that will allow us to have a renaissance, just like in the 1950s, where people will think creatively about how they're going to use electricity and energy to improve their lives. New applications of heating and cooling, new applications in the home, that for business is really exciting, because as long as we're still in a consumption-based, competitive business environment, it's a race to the bottom in terms of the lowest kilowatt hour of electricity that we can provide. And it's hard to build sustainable profits in that type of an environment. But if we're moving into an area where you have a premium offering, a new capability that you can bring to customers through this technology, the business competitive equation changes, and it opens up the possibility for greater profit potential and longer term competitive barriers. So this is all evolving over the next 10 years, and it's a really exciting time. We see it already happening in the residential area in some cases, and we see it happening, as John's business is exploiting, in certain parts of the commercial and industrial sector.
Outstanding. Okay, so I was thinking maybe we'll go switch to the group now, do our jazz portion of this. We took a car over here, actually an Uber, so took an Uber from the hotel, happened to be an electric vehicle, and talking about the fact that there's charging stations available, one fast charging station available here, most nearby, that enabled this certain individual to charge during the day, make numerous rides, go charge again, and continue on his way. And then it got me thinking, us all thinking about where are we going with electric vehicles as we talk about distributed energy resources, how do those intermix, and how can we utilize those from an effective transport capability, but also possibly even use those to make the grid even more stable and secure as we think about how that evolves to interaction between being on the edge to participating in the actual grid system. And maybe, well, I'll just open it up. Where do we go with EVs? I know penetration today, I think roughly 1% of the light vehicle fleet, but suggestions that goes to 10% or greater, varying widely depending on which of those you believe. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we go with EVs.
Yeah, I mean, we're investors in a company called Proterra, which is an electric bus company that makes a 100% all-electric bus, no overhead lines or anything, that can, has a range of over 300 miles per day, meaning that they can complete a route for 80% of the routes in the US for city buses on one charge. And that's a breakthrough game changer, which I think we're pretty excited about. There's over 100 of them on the road today. But I then saw Elon Musk, of course, not to be one-upped by a bus, on Friday gave a little bit of a teaser for his semi-truck that they will be launching, not on the road, but unveiling this summer. And that truck is meant to pull a full load coast to coast, obviously with charging in between, but with a complementary infrastructure that's going to allow them to fuel up similar to diesel. And it's a much higher performing vehicle because of the torque that if anyone's been in an electric vehicle that you've experienced, it will be a better performing vehicle than today's semis. Our electric bus at Proterra is a better performing vehicle than the buses on the road. And as we were saying on the drive over, when there's a 200-mile plus range Leaf, a 200-mile plus Tesla Model 3, and the Chevy Bolt with the same kind of range, you have enough proof points that the rationale for holding back starts to dissipate in all of these fields, not just passenger vehicles, but all the way up to long-haul trucking. So I think we are right on the cusp of a massive transformation in transportation.
Yeah, I'll just quickly jump in here. So I spent the last 4.5 years in the Middle East working for an entity called Masdar, which is the government of Abu Dhabi, 7th largest oil producer in the world, mission to essentially build a city in the middle of the desert. And what they were trying to solve was a problem that said, 75% of the world's population is going to live in a city. Those cities are going to be next to a coast, so you're going to have the ability to do desalination. You're not going to have a lot of land, so you can't have huge solar fields out or large wind farms. And you're going to need to have a relationship with transportation which hasn't been seen before. So some great learnings from that were things like streets should be used to walk on. And underneath the streets is where the transportation should be, and it should all be level 5 automation, meaning that you don't have any controls over that. That's something they've been working on for 10 years. So, when I live in San Francisco now, and I see driverless vehicles running around the city, it's amazing to me that we're still using streets for transportation versus that's incredibly valuable real estate that isn't there. It's also the way that we design buildings and how we think about not only the materials that get involved in buildings, but how we think about the spatial relationship of, the Salesforce Tower that should be hopefully coming online soon in San Francisco, daunting the skyline that's there. The simple idea was that they couldn't create a campus that took up real estate, so they said, let's create a vertical campus. And that's an interesting idea that people are going to start thinking about of how do you deal with transportation? How do you deal with where should people park their cars, or should cars not be above on the street level and we kind of go underneath? I think that entire infrastructure is yet to be built out, and that's where you're going to see, I think, in the next 10 or 15 years, massive improvements.
All right, thank you. John, anything from your perspective?
I'd add a couple quick things. One is, a lot of the intermittency and grid issues that we see today have been created by renewables that are, intermittent, quite frankly. And when you start to think about all this EV charging, and a lot of it could be at the end of the day when people are charging before they go home, which is going to strain the grid. So that'll add more complexity, more of an impetus behind needing this digital grid. But also, at 80% effectiveness, the batteries in an EV typically will need to be changed out. Those are perfect for grid applications. So that will be a whole step change in the cost of battery storage for the grid, and I think it'll really be an enabler, and we'll see that trend over the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, I think we're right at our time. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here, especially please thank our panelists, Andrew, Peter, Anup, John, and by all means, please come say hello to us. Have a wonderful day, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.